So the Rules Committee will come to order. So many people may not realize it, but harmful so-called forever chemicals are found in many of the products we use every day, from food packaging to cookware to clothing, even firefighting foam. They pollute our drinking water, they harm our environment, and they threaten public health. But right now, they are not designated as harmful chemicals, which they are. That's why we're considering H.R. 535 today. This bill directs the EPA to designate forever chemicals as hazardous substances to better protect our drinking water and to lessen the risks to our first responders. So having said that, I'm happy to turn now to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our single item today is H.R. 535, the PFAS Action Act of 2019. H.R. 535 is a bill that could and should have been bipartisan. It attempts to address a problem, contamination, and environmental damage caused by two groups of manufactured chemicals that everyone in both parties agrees is a problem. But instead of proceeding on a bipartisan basis, the majorities decided to move forward with a partisan bill that stands no chance of becoming law. During the markup at the Energy and Commerce Committee, Republicans proposed bipartisan compromise language to address this problem that's already passed the Senate and could head to the President's desk today. But unfortunately, the majorities rejected that compromise. It's a shame and unfortunately indicative of how the majority's chosen to operate since taking control of the House. At the beginning of the 116th Congress, we in the minority were promised more openness, more inclusiveness, and more bipartisanship. But instead, we've seen bipartisan bills turned into partisan ones, simply to make political points. We've yet to have a single open rule throughout, despite promises to the contrary, and we've seen vastly more Democratic amendments made in order than Republican or bipartisan ones. I remind my colleagues that this was not the case when Republicans were in the majority. In fact, Republicans in the last Congress made more Democratic amendments in order than those proposed by our own side. Mr. Chairman, at some point, the majority must decide whether they are here to make political points or to make law. Today's bill is indicative of the approach the majority's chosen thus far, to make political point instead of passing a bill that can actually become law. I would strongly urge the majority to reconsider this direction and choose instead to move forward with more bipartisanship, more openness, and a greater effort to actually govern. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, and I thank you for your opening statement. I now want to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony in H.R. 535, the PFAS Action Act. Chairman Pallone and Mr. Shimkus, we're delighted that you're here. Anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. So I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Chairman Pallone, for any opening statement he wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to be here today to support the PFAS Action Act of 2019. It's a comprehensive package of strategies to regulate PFAS chemicals, clean up contamination, and protect public health. I'm not going to get into the details of what PFAS is, but it's a very persistent chemical in the environment and an urgent threat to public health. Unfortunately, this administration is failing impacted communities, and so Congress must act. If I thought that the EPA could do this or would do this, I wouldn't be here today. The inaction by the EPA has basically meant that PFAS contamination has spread across the country. You might say, is this something new? Well, it really isn't. We know about the harms of PFAS since as early as the 1950s, particularly at defense sites, because it was used quite often as defense sites in the foam that was used to fight fires. But even so, even though EPA has known about the harm for decades, we still have no protections from PFAS in drinking water, no limits on air emissions, no cleanup requirements, no limits on dumping into our waterways, and no restrictions on PFAS disposal or use. We don't even have a labeling of PFAS ingredients to allow consumers to protect themselves from it. And the problem is that the longer we delay, the worse the problem becomes. It spreads, and it becomes even more of a health problem. So that's why I think it's important to pass legislation. And I would urge the committee to pass it and also pass out the manager's amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shimkus?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to be here with my chairman, Frank Pallone. We are good friends. This just shows you that you can agree to disagree without being disagreeable. And I appreciate his friendship. First of all, let me just say, when you hear the term PFAS, it's easy to say PFAS as it's one chemical, one element, one formula. PFAS is a class of chemicals. In fact, we don't even know how many there are in this class. We used the number 5,000 in our debate. I think EPA has a list of 7,800. We do know there is concern on two, which is PFOA and PFAS, but this is a family of chemicals. It's like saying ban all fruits because oranges are bad. So our objection to this whole debate is that we are going to politically ban a class of chemicals, 5,000 to 7,800 chemicals, without knowing whether they're dangerous. And we're going to do it politically. And this will be the first time in 40 years. We've never done this. Our government has never politically banned a chemical. It has done it through the scientific method and the process, through due diligence, research, and a determination of the health effects. So our concern with this is, first of all, it doesn't do due diligence to see what is actually hazardous. And two, it may pull out two, PFOA and PFAS, but if there's 5,000 compounds, what about the other 4,998? Are they all hazardous? It's taken EPA over 20 years just to start determining whether PFOA and PFAS are bad. This bill also takes 5 years and says, in 5 years, EPA, you have to get a determination of all the rest of these 5,000 compounds. EPA hasn't been able to do 2 in 20 years. How in the world are they going to do 5,000 in 5 years? This bill has a lot of problems and a lot of challenges. We wish that we could have worked together. Obviously we couldn't. We want to move on identifying the hazardous chemicals and doing remediation and cleaning them up. But without knowing exactly if a chemical is hazardous, and then adding over 5,000 more that you haven't even started to study, is more messaging than policy. And that's why we will work hard to either amend the bill where it's more acceptable on the floor, which is in your court, at least allowing that to happen, or we'll have to vote against it on the floor. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shimkus, in your dissenting views in the committee report, you said that H.R. 535 mandates multiple aggressive actions, such as a mandate of certain PFAS as hazardous substance under CERCLA. Has Congress ever statutorily mandated a substance designation before?
No, never.
Mr. Shimkus, in addition to the rulemaking process already in place under CERCLA, EPA, and this administration, they have a plan to protect our nation's drinking water and help affected communities better monitor, detect, and address PFAS. Shouldn't we let the regulators do their jobs rather than have Congress take the unusual step of statutorily mandating a substance designation?
Absolutely.
And you said in your testimony, so I want to be clear and confirm my understanding, that over a dozen PFAS provisions were enacted into law through the NDAA and the FY 2020 appropriations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Shimkus, is there any merit to there was a great deal that we could have done that would have meant a lot to a lot of communities right away, that we could have collaborated on in a bipartisan way and not received a veto message from the president?
Yeah, as you know, legislating is an art, it's not a science, and it's done through different means. The safe drinking water aspect was left on the shelf and wasn't rolled into the NDAA, and so we lost that battle, and it's brought back here again. Safe Drinking Water Act is under our jurisdiction, it's under my subcommittee's jurisdiction, and there's a key provision of that, which is, can the local, rural, small-town municipal water systems afford to do this, right? And so the whole question is testing of chemicals that you don't even know how to test, because we don't know how to test these yet. We haven't even developed a testing system for 4,998 of these. So how do you test for it to begin with? Then you don't have a system to clean it. You may be able to do PFOA and PFAS, but how do you even clean up the other 4,998 in 5 years?
We have an additional witness here. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson. Anything that you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record, and we welcome you here. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come forth and offer an amendment. Ranking Member Cole and members of the committee, I'm here tonight to offer an amendment to H.R. 535, which would require the EPA administrator to certify Congress that the agency has completed its PFAS action plan before the underlying bill may be implemented. First used in the 1940s, PFAS are synthetic chemicals used in a variety of products, both commercial and industrial. The U.S. military also relies heavily on the use of PFAS. They can be found in countless everyday objects, such as pizza boxes, food wrappers, nonstick cookware, stain-resistant furniture, water-resistant clothes, and firefighters' protective suits, among others. PFAS can be found in this very room, like the plastic cover on the staplers, the rubber soles of the shoes, the carpet underneath our feet, or the umbrellas being used for tonight's weather. In my Central Ohio district, where manufacturing is a pillar of our economy, many industries use PFAS in their products. Our region is also home to the Columbus Airport, which has special firefighting foam containing PFAS on hand to put out any fuel blazes. Right now, I want to focus on one critical use of these substances: medical devices. We are here tonight to discuss how to make America safer and promote public health by better regulating PFAS. Yet, we are ignoring the important role these substances play in healthcare and the well-being of patients. PFAS materials are often central components of medical devices because of their biocompatibility and durability. They are used in life-saving applications such as heart patches and grafts, stents, and surgical mesh. They are found in catheters and other medical tubing, guide wires, and sterile coatings like those on hospital gowns and masks. These substances are necessary to fight infections in hospital settings. I agree with the authors of this bill that we must be cautious with the use of chemicals and reduce the levels in our water supplies. But I believe there is a better way to accomplish this goal than to automatically list PFAS as hazardous, thereby risking public safety in another way through jeopardy to medical devices. That's why I was thrilled to learn that in response to greater awareness of this issue and rising public health concerns, the EPA announced the PFAS Action Plan. As part of this plan, the EPA works with federal, state, and local partners to understand and act on known PFAS dangers. The EPA's PFAS Action Plan is a comprehensive, cross-agency approach. This plan includes concrete steps to monitor, detect, and address PFAS contamination. One of the major steps worth noting is the EPA's December 3rd proposal for the maximum contaminant level. This important step toward public safety is currently under interagency review. For the well-being of Americans, we should support this plan's success. The administration has demonstrated that one of its top priorities is the research and necessary regulation of PFAS. Our federal government should maintain its key role in researching PFAS, which is why I've supported EPA, CDC, and other agencies' research in this matter. Further, the EPA is an appropriate agency to regulate PFAS. In order to be mindful of taxpayer dollars, Congress should allow the EPA to complete its work before casting such a wide net when labeling 5,000+ PFAS as hazardous. This is an opportunity for Congress to be proactive rather than reactive by supporting thoughtful action that ensures the safety of the American public and our environment. I invite you to join me in supporting my amendment.
Any questions? Thank you very much. I think anybody else wishing to testify? I guess that's it. That will close the hearing portion of this bill. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings.
Aye.
Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Raskin? Aye. Mr. Raskin? Aye. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli? Aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala? Aye. Mr. Dusonier? Mr. Dusonier? Aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Anybody else have anything they want to add? Without objection, the committee is adjourned. The Rules Committee will come to order. Last Thursday, on the order of President Trump, the United States mounted a lethal drone attack on Iraqi soil that killed Iranian General Soleimani. According to the outgoing Prime Minister, this strike was carried out without Iraqi permission or knowledge. More troubling still, President Trump didn't even consult Congress beforehand. Last night, Iran launched more than a dozen missiles in response, striking 2 military bases in Iraq used by coalition and U.S. forces. More than 4,000 members of the armed forces, the people we all represent, are now being sent to the Persian Gulf, all without any input from the People's Chamber. I'm glad that the United States and Iran have now taken a step back from the brink of war, but I still didn't hear a plan from the President in his remarks this morning. I'm not convinced, even after the administration's briefing today, that it has any idea of what comes next. Taking a breath is a good thing. I pray we don't have another war in the Middle East. We need to end these costly, endless wars, not creating new ones. But the world is less safe because of the President's chaotic foreign policy, and his actions will have repercussions across the region and the world. This is no time for us to sit on the sidelines. Congress shouldn't be an afterthought. The Constitution is crystal clear. The President may be Commander-in-Chief, but only Congress has the power to declare war. We are a voice for the troops being deployed. We are the voice for their families who are worried sick that as loved ones receive deployment orders. And we are the voice for our constituents who are living in fear of what comes next. That's why this majority is acting today on this resolution. It makes it clear to the administration that Congress needs to authorize any additional hostilities with Iran. Matters of war and peace were never meant to be decided solely by a president holed up in the Oval Office. That's true not just for President Trump, but for any president. I hope my Republican colleagues will do what's right and join us, because no matter what you think of the President's decisions to strike Soleimani, and I know that there are differing opinions, we should all agree that Congress has a role to play here. Democrats don't want war with Iran. I don't believe most Republicans want war with Iran. And the American people certainly don't want a war with Iran. I want to turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our hearing today is on an emergency item arising under the War Powers Resolution concerning Iran. As the committee is aware, I've long been supportive of Congress exercising its authority with respect to war powers. I'm a firm believer that Congress has a role in committing America's military to battle. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 states clearly that the President cannot commit the United States to an armed conflict without the consent of the United States Congress. The resolution today arises following last week's action in which the United States Armed Forces killed Qasem Soleimani, an Iranian general and terrorist leader responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans and the wounding of thousands of more. It also follows last night's event in which Iran fired more than a dozen missiles at U.S. military facilities inside Iraq, and President Trump's speech to the nation this morning on this action. The Department of Defense has said that it struck Soleimani in response to active plans to attack American diplomats and service members in Iraq and in the Middle East. The President very clearly has the legal authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to use defensive military force in response to immediate threats to American personnel, even in the absence of congressional approval. This is not regular order, Mr. Chairman. We should have a debate on authorizing military force. We should have a debate on committing the American military to an armed conflict. We cannot have that debate if we skip regular order and push ahead blindly to the vote. And we cannot have this debate until we have all the facts. But that's not what the resolution before us today is about. Today's resolution is about whether the President has the authority to protect Americans in light of clear evidence of an impending attack. the president not only has that authority, he has that duty. It's worth noting here the sequence of events. We've had a series of Iranian actions, first aimed at ships in the Gulf, then aimed at an attack on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, then multiple rocket attacks on American forces inside of Iraq by Shia militias aligned with the Iranian government. It only was when an American was killed, American soldiers were wounded, and Mr. General Soleimani was frankly violating UN resolution by being in Iraq in the first place, that the president felt compelled to act.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the gentleman's comments as we move forward on some of these matters. This simply is a reaffirmation that, that Congress has a role. If this president or any president wants to go to war with Iran or anyone else, they need to come to Congress for our approval. And I would just say one final thing. One of the things we're going to do, and I think we've talked to you about this, is, we have a committee on expedited procedures here on the Rules Committee, a subcommittee, and we're going to start doing a series of hearings on these matters, not only with regard to war powers, but with regard to declaring emergencies and what is the proper role of Congress. And my hope is that through a series of thoughtful hearings that we will come up with bipartisan legislation, maybe a McGovern-Cole bill or even a Cole-McGovern bill might not be bad. Because these are serious matters that, quite frankly, transcend this administration. It's all administrations. But anyway, having said that, I would now like to recognize the distinguished chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Engel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me say at the outset that the world is a better place without Qasem Soleimani in it. He was the architect of so much violence and suffering. He had American blood on his hands. But in foreign policy, we have to weigh all the factors and potential consequences of an action such as the strike that took out Soleimani. We have a responsibility, Mr. Chairman, to make sure that this administration does not plunge our country into another ill-advised war, which is why we need to adopt Representative Slotkin's resolution. If the administration wants to use military force against Iran, then they must come to Congress first. This measure would direct the President to terminate the use of armed force against Iran without congressional authorization unless it's necessary to respond to an imminent armed attack against the United States. Again, I repeat, an imminent armed attack, not something that might happen sometime in the future. Under the Constitution, the President always has the power to defend America. We all believe in defending America, so this resolution explicitly preserves this right. But it also makes clear that this is a limited exception and the President should not abuse it. Mr. Chairman, no one is going to mistake me for an apologist for Iran. Iran is the world's most prolific state sponsor of terrorism. Iran is going to continue a policy of provocation and destabilization. But we have to think about the consequences for our national security. So we need to dial this situation back. We need to exert American leadership, responsible American leadership, working with partners to pressure the regime in Tehran and keep them in check.
Ranking Member McCall, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole. And I recall back when President Obama took down Osama bin Laden, Republican members joined our colleagues on the other side of the aisle and praised the president as Americans first. Unfortunately, today I don't see that happening, and I don't see the president getting credit where I believe it's due, and I believe that this could embolden our enemy. I think we're ignoring the assessments of intelligence and military professionals. In getting to Soleimani, I was a counterterrorism federal prosecutor. He is one of the most dangerous terrorists that we knew. He was involved in the Iranian plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States on American soil. He oversaw Iran's support for Assad in Syria, including recruitment of foreign fighters for Assad. He brought the Russians into Syria. He played a key role in the crackdown on protesters in Iran that killed hundreds of Iraqis. And it should be clear to any reasonable person that Soleimani posed a long-term threat to the United States and to innocent civilians throughout the Middle East. For the last 2 decades, he was, in my judgment, the biggest terror threat in the region. According to the Department of Defense, in the last 2.5 months, Soleimani and his proxies launched 12 strikes against U.S. forces and facilities in Iraq. And on December 27th, Iranian proxies killed an American and injured 4 U.S. servicemen near Kirkuk. On December 31st, Iranian proxies launched a fiery direct assault on the United States Embassy in Baghdad. But Soleimani wasn't done. He was actively plotting to take action that would put dozens, if not hundreds, of U.S. lives at risk. And DOD went further, saying the attack targeted American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region. Some people say, why did he choose to do this at this time? Because our embassy was attacked. Because there was an imminent threat to Americans, both military and diplomats. Soleimani was a lawful military objective. And the president, under his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief, had ample domestic legal authority to take him out without additional congressional authorization. It's important to point out that Mr. Soleimani was designated as a terrorist by the United States. And I'm glad the administration did not hesitate to take bold action given the level of the threat. Soleimani showed us through the embassy attack and the attacks on U.S. forces that he was serious about harming Americans. Our intelligence community saw his next plan coming together, and our military, under the direction from our president, acted. I thank the president and the men and women of our intelligence community and military for upholding their responsibility to protect American lives. I've been with the president on many occasions on this. He's very clear he does not want war, does not want to start a new war. He wants to wind down the endless wars. He wants to reduce our footprint. He said, and he says today, he wants to make peace with Iran. He wants to see a vibrant, prosperous Iran. None of us in this room want to see an escalation with Iran. And I think that a policy of de-escalation and calling upon our NATO allies to exercise diplomatic channels, in my judgment, is the best step forward. And I think the president's making that choice to move toward the ladder of de-escalation. I'm concerned, instead of supporting the president, that though this resolution could embolden Iran and see Americans divided on the issue rather than united against what I consider, and many justifiably so, as the largest state sponsor of terror. And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. Anyway, having said that, I yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma.
I just think in this instance, the president was so right to act and had every justification, and we shouldn't be raising this particular matter in connection with him taking out a terrorist who had killed so many Americans, had wounded thousands more, and goodness knows how many Muslims have been killed by this guy, a lot more than Americans. This was a bad actor. And the president was right to do what he did. I'm sorry we as a country didn't act earlier under both Republicans and Democrats. But this was the right thing to do. This was the right time to do it. They didn't have a lot of time to act. I think the president chose the moment, acted decisively, and we're all safer for it. But yield back. Thank you.
My good friend from Oklahoma makes, as usual, a very, very compelling argument that I disagree with. And I disagree for the reason that if the president had enough time to tell Republicans and people in Mar-a-Lago that something big was about to happen, then he had ample time, in my judgment, to tell the Gang of Eight, at the very least, here in Congress, which was not done.
Let me ask you, if you wouldn't mind, going back to your opening statement and just walk us through again the data that you presented as you began your opening remarks. Could I ask you to do that?
Sure. And Soleimani, and I followed terrorists prior to coming to Congress, and as chairman of Homeland Security, Norm and I served together. And it's quite a timeline, and it goes back 2 decades. And, 1979, the Ayatollah presides over a reign of terror in the region, and this guy is the chief architect of terror in the Middle East, killing hundreds of Americans, injuring thousands. In Syria, killing tens of thousands of Muslims in Syria, bringing the Russians in. Lebanon, he was creating what's called the Shia Crescent, which is, as Elliot knows, the land bridge that was going to create a bridge between Iran, Iraq, into Syria, Lebanon, and then Hamas down in Gaza. Remember, Quds means Jerusalem. So Quds Force, and this was the guy who's the commander of the Quds Force, his really primary goal was to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. He's an evil man.
No American can dispute that Soleimani created, supported, and directed a network of terrorist organizations that spread havoc in the Middle East. In Syria, he made it possible for Assad regime to respond with brutality to its own people's demands for freedom. More than 500,000 Syrians have died since 2011, and millions more have been displaced from their homes. During the Iraq War, Soleimani oversaw 3 camps in Iran where his elite Quds force trained and equipped Iraqi militias. According to the U.S. government, these fighters have killed more than 600 American soldiers since 2003. And lastly, I'm going to read another part where it says, some Democrats have said that killing Soleimani will lead us into war with Iran. And here we are today, this war resolution.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin. Aye. Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala. Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Clerk,
aye.
report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion is agreed to, and I will handle it for the Democrats.
Mr. Burgess will manage.
Okay, no other business. The Rules Committee is adjourned.